So, welcome everyone to Professor Simon Blackburn's third Pufendorf lecture on the topic Truth and Post-Truth. The title of today's talk is The Genuine Limits of Reason. And as usual, there will be time for questions after the talk. And today also there will be an informal reception in the departmental kitchen after the questions. So everyone is welcome. But first, please, Simon.
Thank you very much, and thank you again all for turning up on such a beautiful afternoon. I think you're all very conscientious. I think if a visiting philosopher came to Cambridge and started talking about truth on an afternoon like this, everybody would be watching the cricket. So, thank you very much. Right, I'm not sure I'm going to stick to the title very much. I had hoped or had thought that by now I'd be getting on to talking about further about epistemology and reason, which is why the title of the talk was to do with that. But in fact, these things, as you see, I don't lecture from notes, and I certainly don't read my lectures, and they have a rhythm of their own, and I'm going a bit slowly and maybe going a bit off-piste as well. So just bear with me. Okay, I was going to pick up where we left off. Remember, I quoted Rorty saying this, and using the example of the map maker, Mercator, in my example, and thinking about what was needed in order to both generate a good map and in order to read a good map. I thought that even with a deflationary theory of truth, which it seems to me a pragmatist ought to embrace, you couldn't really endorse that view of Rorty's. That view, I think, is completely off the wall, because if we say, why were Galileo's predictions successful? Well, he predicted that the rate of acceleration of bodies in a gravitational field would be independent of their mass. That's one of the things Galileo is alleged to have been a pioneer in discovering. And it is. The acceleration of a body in a gravitational field is independent of its mass. And that's the deflationist way of saying he got something right. And because he got something right, or said something true, his predictions were successful. And it's because his predictions were successful that he was famous. I mean, if he'd said that, for example, the acceleration of bodies in the gravitational field was entirely dependent or varied directly as their mass or varied directly as the fourth power of their mass or whatever, he'd have been wrong and he wouldn't have been as famous as he is. So it's a very simple thing. But in this, there's no mention of truth. The notion of truth does not occur because in deflationist language, you get past the notion of truth. You just say the proposition that's in question. So, for example, instead of saying that Einstein's famous because he said lots of true things, well, you can say that, but it's really a way of generalizing over lots and lots of instances, like Einstein said that E equals mc squared, and E does equal mc squared. I make the assertion in my own voice, but I don't talk about its truth. The notion of truth is no part of the explanatory machinery, if you like. And so that's the deflationist way of saying what we need to say about Galileo, but without invoking any kind of metaphysically suspect or weird or pragmatically suspicious notion of truth. I think I didn't put this terribly well yesterday, and I'm just going to go back over some of the reasons why people dislike, and why I think they're right to dislike, a correspondence theory of truth. I got a sense in the question time that quite a lot of you are convinced enough about what I said about Mercator and about representation, and you're quite happy with that. But you didn't think that that chimed very well with hostility to a correspondence theory of truth. And I quite sympathize with you because I think, once you've got representation, you seem to have some notion of correspondence. You've got a relationship between a symbol and a thing. A symbol on your paper, on your map, say, and a thing in the world. And that seems at least to be halfway towards the notion of correspondence. So I thought I'd just go back over why people said these. I gave you this slide showing Davidson, Rorty, Strawson and Quine all chiming, all singing from the same hymn sheet, as we say. That is, all singing that the notion of correspondence truth is dead, it's not to be tolerated, it's hopeless, and so on. But I didn't really give you very much about their reasoning, and so what I want to do today is start by just going back over some of the reasoning. So let's ask, is truth a genuine relational property such as correspondence, or is it not? The people who say it's not, they may call themselves minimalist, deflationist, disquotationist, redundancy theorists, prosentential theorists, that's another sort of classification. There may be slight differences here between these different approaches, but basically they're all on the not side. There's not a relationship signalled by the notion of truth. If you did think there was some relationship, you've got certain choices. The correspondence theory thinks there's going to be a relationship to elements of the world. A coherence theory might suppose that there's a relationship a true proposition has to bear to other truth bearers, other propositions. So it's being part of a coherent whole, which makes truth. And this is a view that Davidson, amongst others, espoused in the 80s. A pragmatist might suppose that it's some relationship to human practice and success that constitutes the notion of truth. But each of those is relational, and that's the point. Well, now the big argument against this is, I think, an argument from what I call transparency, and it's due to Frege. So you take a series, P, you take some proposition, doesn't matter what, a proposition which is capable of truth and falsity. So proposition, there's an iPad on this table. Well, let's take a prettier proposition. There are flowers on this table. It's capable of truth. In fact, it is true. There are flowers on this table. It's true that there are flowers on this table. It's true that it's true that there are flowers on this table. It's true that it's true that it's true. And you can obviously go up forever. You can iterate true forever. And you're not getting anywhere. Really, the content of all these is just no more and no less than that there are flowers on the table. You're not adding anything when you talk about the truth of the proposition. Suppose you said corresponds to the facts that P, you get P corresponds to the facts that P, corresponds to the fact that corresponds to the fact that P, and so on, up the regress. Or if you're a coherentist, you have P coheres with whatever it's supposed to cohere with. It coheres with whatever it's supposed to cohere with to say that P coheres with it, and so on up. Or P, it's got practical utility that P, it's got practical utility that it's got practical utility that P, and so on up. Each of those regresses should mean the same thing if the correspondence, coherence, or pragmatist was giving a decent analysis of the notion of truth. They should, so the regresses should mimic the truth regress. But Frege argued that they can't. None of those propositions can both introduce a substantial, interesting relationship, something like, say, a causal relationship, or a relationship of fitting some other body of truth, and maintain the transparency property. The transparency being that there's nothing added as you go up that regress. There's nothing changing as you go up that regress. Because in principle, you could have it corresponds to the facts that P. Oh, that's interesting. That's a sort of relationship with the world. Now, does the fact that P has that relationship with the world itself have a relationship with the world? Well, that should be a second and different question. And maybe it doesn't. Maybe P has a nice relationship with the world, but that P has that relationship with the world doesn't have a relationship to the world. And so on up. There's no particular reason, or at least you'd have to give a reason, you'd have to find a reason, for saying that the iterations have the same transparency property as truth. Similarly, for the coherence, it might be that it's true that P coheres with some body of knowledge, but that P coheres with that body of knowledge may not cohere with that body of knowledge. There's no reason for thinking it should do, and so on. So the Fregean reason for doubting that there could be a substantive relational property corresponding to the notion of truth is that the substantive relational property would not necessarily, or would not, there'd be no reason for thinking that it would share the transparency property of truth. So that's a reason, that's Frege's reason. So, in the first series, TTTTT, etc., each member has exactly the same content as any other. None says anything more or different from the first. That's a transparency property. If corresponds with facts, etc., elucidations, then they must share the transparency property. If the latter, it offers no elucidation. If the former, it cannot share the transparency property. A new property or relation is introduced at each stage, describing something about the previous proposition. Because the basic argument is you're getting a different proposition at each stage of these regresses, but you're not getting a different proposition at each stage of that regress. So that's the Fregean argument against the relational view. And Frege thought that Frege seemed to think that it messed up the correspondence theory of truth, but he didn't, I think, go so far as to saying it messes up all possible theories of truth. But quite a lot of authors have taken it that it does. So that's the start. Okay, a second argument, which is perhaps in a way easier to understand, I don't know. I find the Fregean argument both easy to understand and easy to accept, but perhaps not everyone does. But a second argument, which is very different, is the argument that a correspondence theory of truth brings in an epistemological problem of comparison. And this goes back, I think, to Neurath and Hempel rejecting Schlick's views of truth because of that. And earlier, it came up in the British Idealists and the pragmatist Frederick Canning Schiller, who asked, how can thought determine whether it correctly copies what transcends it? And this is also the kind of question that Berkeley's asking when he says, how can an idea resemble anything except another idea? You can't get outside, as it were. And the image here is, I think, well expressed by Quine. We cannot detach ourselves from our conceptual scheme and compare it objectively with an unconceptualized reality. Hence it is meaningless, I suggest, to inquire into the absolute correctness of a conceptual scheme as a mirror of reality. And of course that's, again, that's a metaphor that Rorty is going to reject. Our standard for appraising basic changes of a conceptual scheme must be not a realist standard of correspondence to reality, but a pragmatic standard. You've got to ask whether the change in conceptual scheme, that comes when, for example, when you think of space-time in relativistic terms as opposed to Newtonian terms, or change in conceptual scheme that comes when you change your favourite sociological theory, change Marxism for something else, and so on. The standards have to be not realistic standards of correspondence to reality, but a pragmatic standard. I think that's a very powerful argument in many people's minds. It's not quite such a powerful argument in my own mind. I prefer the Fregean argument. And the reason is this, that you get this kind of expression of the Quine argument, let's call it that. This is Rorty. There's no way to get outside our beliefs and language, so to find some test other than coherence. Davidson, there's no clear meaning to the idea of comparing whether our beliefs with reality or confronting our hypothesis with observation. And the attack on comparison is sometimes supplemented by remarks about the myth of the given and impossibility of unmediated or immediate access to reality. And that goes back to Kant. The problem with all that is it makes it sound as if you're being asked to reject a correspondence theory in favour of coherence theory, pure coherence theory of truth. And that, I think, makes nonsense of the procedures that I was talking about yesterday. Mercator is not involved in simply in an activity of seeing whether a belief of his coheres with beliefs he's already got. He's involved in the very different activity of making observations and measurements. And C. Davidson, there's no clear meaning to the idea of comparing our beliefs with reality or confronting our hypotheses with observation. Well, one might want to say, hang on, the first of those, perhaps I can see what you're on about. I can see why you don't like the idea of comparing our theories with reality or comparing our beliefs with reality. It makes it sound as though you've got you've got in front of you, here's my body of beliefs, and over here's reality, and do they compare? And that does sound sort of fantastical. Like you could have, say, a portrait, and here's the sitter, do they compare? Well, that's, his face is a bit squarer than it comes out on the portrait. You can make that kind of comparison, but you can't look at your body of beliefs in that sort of way, and then sort of pop behind them and see what the world's like. Your body of beliefs is your view about what the world's like. So of course you can't compare it with something else. You can just add more beliefs. But you can add more beliefs by observation. And so when Davidson goes on to say, confronting our hypotheses with observation, well, there's a perfectly good sense in which you can confront your hypotheses with observation. Mercator might have guessed that there was a pond southwest of Elsinore, to use yesterday's example, but then he had to go out and look. And that's comparing his belief with observation, or at least it's confronting his belief with observation. And it may be that he couldn't find a pond southwest of Elsinore, so he wasn't going to put down on his map a symbol suggesting that there was a pond in the southwest of Elsinore. And that's not a matter of staying within a body of belief. It's a matter of going and looking, of conducting an observation. And all of, Rorty, I think, Quine, Davidson, and, Davidson here especially, I think, they all sort of jump from disliking the correspondence theory of truth to saying things which suggest they've slightly lost touch with what's involved in processes of verification and processes of measurement and processes of going into the laboratory. The earlier idealists at least had an excuse for, as it were, jumping from hostility to correspondence to coherence, because they didn't have laboratories and they weren't conducting measurements. By and large, the actual enterprise that people like Bosanquet, Bradley, Joachim, the early British idealists were most familiar with were enterprises of history. And in history, of course, you can't conduct a measurement. You can't go and see whether there were more troops at the Battle of Agincourt on the English side than the French side, because you can't go to the Battle of Agincourt. Mercator can go outside Elsinore and look at the park and see whether there's a pond. You can't in the same way go and look at the Battle of Agincourt. All you can do is scrabble around amongst further historical testimonies to see which story about the Battle of Agincourt seems to stack up the best. And that can seem like an exercise of coherence, of simply establishing the coherence of one account of the numbers involved in the Battle of Agincourt with other accounts, or other things we know about the armies of the day, or other things we know about the populations of the different countries, and juggling them together until you get the most coherent possible story. So you can see why the British idealists had an excuse for a coherent theory of truth. But I don't think that translates into the epistemological situation of the scientist. The scientist who's got a laboratory, he's got instrumentation, he's got observations he can make and replicate. And so I think that Rorty, Quine and Davidson, working in a much more scientific environment where science was, as it were, the the epistemological golden boy, it was the philosophy of science that you needed to give a good account of, they had much less excuse for jumping to a coherence theory. And in any case, a coherence theory is, I think, falls exactly to the same argument that Frege gave against the correspondence theory. Okay. A third sort of minimalist argument, again to try and unseat the notion of a robust truth relationship, is this. Suppose we've got a predicate here, is conscious. So you're philosophers of mind, you're interested in consciousness, you're worried about what it means to say that things are conscious and what the criteria are for consciousness and so on. So you've got Andrew, various judgments. Andrew, your friend, is conscious, you're sure of that. Rover, your dog, is conscious, you're pretty sure of that. Nelly the elephant is conscious. Don't know, you may be more prone to dogs than elephants, but okay, well, so say Larry the lobster is conscious, then you get really worried. Do you really believe that lobsters are conscious? Well, anyhow, you're worried about the predicate is conscious. And you've got a genuine problem. It's a good philosophical problem. So in judging whether Larry and Nelly and so on and Rover and Andrew are conscious, you're hoping to talk about the same property. And your philosophical problem is knowing which rules, principles, criteria underlie its application. That's the problem in the philosophy of mind. If there's a difficulty with one judgment, there's a difficulty with all the others. But now consider it's true that penguins waddle. It's true that pigs fly. It's true that Trump can read. 3 remarks involving the notion of truth. Here you're not inclined to think that these introduce an overall issue about true. They introduce 3 entirely different issues settled by different methods. Sorry, I should read settled. By different methods, bearing on utterly distinct things and properties. It's one thing to tell whether penguins waddle. It's another thing to tell whether Trump can read. It's another thing to tell whether pigs fly. There's no common principle involved in all 3 investigations. And a difficulty in one, you may say it's extremely difficult to tell whether Trump can read because blah, 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 you know, he's so surrounded by a fog of mist, a fog of falsehood that we just don't know whether he can read. He only ever seems to look at the television, so maybe we never can tell. It's very difficult to tell whether Trump can read. But that's not a difficulty in telling whether pigs fly. It's not a difficulty in telling whether penguins waddle. I say it's quite easy to tell whether penguins waddle. You just go on a trip to the Antarctic, and as soon as you get off the boat, you'll see them waddling. That's quite easy. But that's different again. They're 3 entirely different processes. It's quite unlike the 3 involving is conscious, where difficulty in determining the criteria of application and the verification procedures for any one judgment is the same as the difficulty in determining the same things for all the different judgments. So the point is that here you've got entirely different, a different set of problems, entirely different set of problems. Oops. Whereas in the case of consciousness you didn't. You had the same predicate introducing the same difficulties in all 3 kinds of judgments. And in any kind of judgment you make using that predicate. But when you've got truth, you look past it. Again, the transparency. You look at whether penguins waddle, that's one procedure. You look at whether pigs fly, that's a different procedure. You look at whether Trump can read, that's a different procedure altogether. Different procedures altogether, no commonality. I like to put this by saying, think of Pontius Pilate. And this is a theological example for you. Pontius Pilate is famously supposed to have said, "What is truth?" when he was involved with people claiming that Jesus had done this, that, or the other, or had broken various laws and so on, and made various claims. And And in one account, he would not stay for an answer. Well, I don't think that's what's said in St. John's Gospel, but anyhow. So Pilate's there, his job is to judge whether Jesus did that or the other, and whether it was legal or not, and so on. And then he suddenly starts asking, what is truth? Well, the right answer to Pilate would have been, get on with your job. Your job is to judge whether P, for some particular P, say Jesus claimed to be an earthly king. Let's suppose that was, did Jesus claim to be an earthly king? Pilate's job might have been to find out whether that was true. Find out whether Jesus said that he was an earthly king. If he did, he's guilty of something or other. If he didn't, he's not. Pausing to say what is truth is simply, as it were, walking off the job. Again, supposing one of you is unfortunate enough to find yourself in court. You're charged with something. You're charged with stealing money from somebody. What you want is the judge to devote his mind to finding out whether you stole that money. Listening to the evidence that you did, listening to the evidence that you didn't. And if you're innocent, it matters very much that he's devoted to that task, he does it carefully, and he comes to the right answer. You don't want a judge who starts saying, what is truth? Say, look, this is what you've got to judge. You get on and judge whether I stole the money. That's the problem in front of you. The problem isn't what is truth. Leave that to the guys in the philosophy department. As soon as you've got a content, you know what is truth is. You know what is involved in judging it, and you know what would count as a decent verification procedure or not. Okay. So there's no common focus, no property or relation that's part of the subject matter each time. So it's true that does not introduce such a real, robust or substantial property or relation. Now, a concession. There is, as I was saying yesterday, plenty of room for word-to-world relationships. I'm not on Rorty's side when you say a world well lost. I'm not trying to take you away from the world. Maybe you can only understand the proposition that, say, Fido is barking if you have some thick relationship, for example, a causal relationship to Fido, and you have some similar successful relation to the property involved in barking. It's detectable by the senses. The point is that the word-to-world or person-to-world relationships don't appear in the concept of truth. They appear in understanding the proposition said to be true or false. So that's where you get the world coming back in. The world comes back in because your terms, the names and the predicates, involve you in relationships with the world. Involve you in sensory relationships to understand the predicate, what goes on when a dog barks, and they involve you probably in causal relationships if you're using names, and we believe Kripke, or something vaguely along Kripke's lines, that to understand a name is to at least suppose yourself to be in possession of a causal link, which links the name back to a particular bearer of the name. So it's not as if you've lost the world. You can't understand propositions, as Kant said, without having both concepts and intuitions, and the intuitions will take you into causal relationships with the world. But there's no need for duplicating all that and saying, and furthermore, there's another relationship with the world, which is involved with the concept of truth. So that's the deflationist argument. And then, of course, there are other difficulties. This is one I'll go through very quickly. Suppose the proposition that penguins waddle corresponds to the fact that penguins waddle. The proposition that cows moo corresponds to the fact that cows moo. What does the proposition that either cows moo or penguins waddle correspond to? The disjunction. Is there a new disjunctive fact it corresponds to? Third fact, the fact that cows moo or penguins waddle. how do we know that if we have the first two facts existing, so does the third? Is logic duplicated by the world? Is there some sort of magic thing that says where you've got an implication that if cows moo, it follows that cows moo or penguins waddle, that you've also got a duplication of facts. The facts sort of tie together by great good luck in exactly the same way that propositions do, propositions and implications of logic. Why would that be so? Why shouldn't we live in a world in which it's a fact that cows moo, or maybe it's a fact that cows moo and a fact that penguins waddle, but there's no fact that cows moo or penguins waddle. Reality just had a hole in it at that point. Well, of course, that's an absurd doubt. Why is it an absurd doubt if you think that correspondence with the fact is a real substantial relationship? Okay. Well, I'm going to leave that now. I don't know that I've been more convincing today than I was yesterday, but I think there are here real difficulties for a correspondence theory of truth. I think there are difficulties for a coherence theory of truth, and I think there are difficulties for that matter, pragmatist theories of truth. James, of course, got into a lot of trouble for the simple formula that what's true is what works. That's not a very convincing formula. So perhaps best be deflationist. Turn your back on the enterprise of defining truth and worry about understanding propositions. Okay. Well, now I'm going to look at another development. A development that's got I've lost my clicker. Oh, here we go. A development that's got a long history in philosophy, certainly in analytical philosophy and in British philosophy, going back to the great founding figures of Hobbes, Hume, Berkeley, Locke. And I showed you this very, very briefly yesterday. Berkeley had a strong pragmatic streak. He talks, that's the paragraph 20 of the introduction to the principles. Beside the communicating of ideas, marked by words is not the chief and only end of language, as commonly supposed. There are other ends, as the raising of some passion, the exciting to or deterring from an action, the putting the mind in some particular disposition, to which the former is in many cases barely subservient and sometimes entirely omitted, when these can be obtained without it, as I think does not unfrequently happen in the familiar use of language. Okay. If by considering the doctrine of force men arrive at the knowledge of many inventions in mechanics, and are taught to frame engines by means of which things difficult and otherwise impossible may be performed, and if the same doctrine which is so beneficial here below serves also as a key to discover the nature of the celestial motions. Remember, Berkeley's writing only a few years after Newton's Principia Mathematica, that's the reference there. Serves also as a key to discover the nature of the celestial motions. Shall we deny that it is of use, either in practice or speculation, because we have no distinct idea of force? And it's a rhetorical question, and obviously thinks, no, we're not going to deny it, it's useful. It's extremely useful, but it's only useful because it, as it were, has a place in a theory. It's not because we know what we mean by force because we've got a picture of it or an idea of it. It's that we mean what we do, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof of the pudding is that we can use it in theories from which we can derive predictions, and indeed which assist us in making inventions like levers and pulleys and things. So the mathematics of force is, as it were, its guarantee of meaning, and the role that the notion has in mechanics. This is a very, very, of course, a very pragmatic view. It's a view that doesn't tie force to some visible magnitude or quantity in the world. It just ties force to having a role in inference, in theory. And Berkeley gives a number of examples of words and areas, if you like, in which this same kind of thing happens. I counted 5 examples. He doesn't think we've got a very good idea of the self. He doesn't think we've got a very good idea of its agency. We've already seen power and force. He doesn't think we've got a very good idea of values or of duties or obligations. He's a bit uncertain, but he is a bishop, about theological language. Before him, Hobbes had said, he's got a marvellous, I haven't got the quotation, Hobbes had a marvellous comparison. He said that people who think they know what they mean when they talk about the deity as being sort of immanent or transcendent or 3 persons in one or timeless or acting out of time or having relationships with the world or not having relationships with the world. Theologians who think they know what they mean when they talk like that, are like a countryman who comes to court and, unfamiliar with its usages, lets drop his hat, and in trying to recover his hat drops his cloak, and in trying to recover his cloak discovers his rusticity and amazement. Discovers meaning betrays or shows. In other words, he's just confused and ill at ease in this new environment. And Berkeley says that's exactly what it's like being a theologian, trying to describe the nature of God. You just discover your confusion and unease, and your rusticity, that fact that you're really out of your depth. And Berkeley sympathizes with that, but of course, being a bishop, he can't go the whole way with Hobbes. Hobbes thought that actually when you produce sentences purporting to describe the nature of God and the nature of God's relationship with the world and so on, what you're really doing is praying. You're not saying anything at all. Your propositions are the nature of oblations, he says, which are basically prayers, not descriptions. So it's got a different function. Your ideas fail you, so your language is to be interpreted as doing something else. And Berkeley also has roughly the same view, I think, of mathematics. Berkeley was, of course, a very good mathematician. He was quite at home with notions of number. Hello, Blondek. But he didn't think we've got good ideas corresponding to numbers. He just thought that we knew how to use them. Okay. So what we've got here, I think, is the beginning of a very general issue in philosophy. And again, it's one which pragmatists differ from realists about, apparently. So suppose we ask a question, a kind of question which is associated with Carnap, the Carnapian external question about a body of thought. And we ask, how is it that we're working in some terms or others? Say in terms of probabilities, might be space, time, causality, substance, self, justice, values, number, God, whatever. We've got some area of discourse, and how come that we have those terms? What's their origin? What do they do for us? Why do we speak in these terms? And you've got basically 2 ways you can go. The realist way is, well, the world requires these descriptions of us. If we didn't give them, we'd be missing things. If you didn't describe the world around you in terms of, say, numbers, you'd be missing numerical facts about the world. If you didn't describe the world around you in terms of, say, causal powers or probabilities or justice or values, you'd be missing those aspects of reality. And that's essentially a metaphysical or realist, if you like, direction of thought. It's metaphysical because you're eventually going to have to describe these things which allegedly you'd be missing if you didn't use this vocabulary, and you might find that quite hard to do without involving yourself in something metaphysical. You could call that representationalism, if you like. The other direction is to say, well, I can find a use for this language, like Berkeley could find a use for the language of force. It's a language that it's healthy, adaptive, it has a genealogy, it has a use, it does something for us. And that's the direction which I would describe as pragmatism, the direction of pragmatism. So you've got a choice in which way you go very often. And if you go that way, you're likely to deal with truth, truth conditions, truth makers, analysis, metaphysics. If you go this way, you're more likely to talk in terms of utility of instruments. You might talk about the way we express ourselves, expressivism comes in, and various other terms get co-opted on either side. You might talk about a construction, you might talk about a projection, you might talk about construction, social constructions, and so on. As you can see, this is a direction which associates the language with a certain kind of receptivity. We're receptive to an aspect of the world. This is more concerned with an invention or a tool, an instrument that we discovered that stands us in good stead as we try to use our language furthering practical projects. So here's an example of this. I've adverted to this example earlier, but I'll just discuss it in a little more detail. Suppose you talk about single case probabilities, the probabilities of singular events like, I don't know, Barcelona winning the European Cup or something. You might say frequencies, but frequencies, of course, can only be detected in classes of things, and here we've got a single case. So, which frequencies? Maybe they're all either 0 or 1 when it comes to a single case, but we don't know which. Maybe they're unknowable. Look, this is just a mess. We can't deal with these frequencies. And that's Richard von Mies, and that was the counsel that he is supposed to have given. I've never actually looked up the original text, but he's often supposed to have banished them. So what are all these bookmakers, actuaries, insurance customers, what are they actually doing? Sorry, I just repeated actuaries, it's a mistake. Because, what's going on in the bars when people talk about whether Barcelona's got a good chance of winning the World Cup this next year, or whatever it is. What are they talking about? Well, along comes Frank Ramsey, FP Ramsey, and gives the answer they're expressing degrees of confidence in the particular events. These are states of mind, maybe credences, and we can think of them as measured by willingness to buy or sell bets at different rates. So basically they're discussing the betting rates, their preferred betting rates on Barcelona winning the World Cup. How much are you prepared to put and at what price? So there's a bookmaker on a racecourse. So Eclipse has at least an evens chance of winning. I might say that on a racecourse. Well, that's an expression of willingness, a disposition to punt $1 to get back $2 if it wins. Or to demand at least $1 if you're to pay out $2 if it wins. Or more accurately, it's a proposition whose assent condition is that kind of disposition or willingness. And then there are various nice things that have been done with this to prove that credences must then obey the rules of probability if you're to avoid the situation in which somebody can just make money off you, treat you as a money pump. I'm not going into all that. This is essentially a pragmatic. Here's why we have this language. We talk about it because we want to compare betting rates. We want to attain degrees of confidence in various things. We want to know what it's worth gambling for what reward. We want to know the costs and benefits associated with confidence in something. And so that's an example of a pragmatic... sorry, go back. Who's that? So that's an example of a pragmatic approach where the metaphysical approach just runs into great difficulty. Von Mies thought insuperable difficulty. The metaphysics or task of finding truth conditions or truth makers for single case probability judgments is just impossible. So that's really, you're on a very sticky wicket. You're on a hiding to nothing if you go that way. But if you go this way, you suddenly have a much more clear run. You have a much clearer view of the topic. Of course, there's then work to be done. I'm not saying that Ramsey's answer just wins, as it were, by a long head, but it gives you a different approach. And what I'm using this to do just now is just illustrate the difference of approach. Okay, so you get a story like this. Here's Everyman, Homer Simpson in his guise of Everyman, and you get a picture like this. Of course, data comes in, the flux, the manifold. There's a reaction in Homer Simpson. There's a change of mental stance, a posture of the mind, a disposition, and that gets expression. Gets expression in terms of probabilities, in the case we just looked at. Hume thought that this happened. The data in the case of causes were regularities in events. Homer's responsive to regularities in events. His mental stance changes, and he becomes happy talking about things causing other things. If you've got values, you've got various, say, pleasures and pains and their distribution in human life. You get for various things and against various other things, and you start talking about values. So in each of these cases, you've got a certain kind of genealogy of the language, but you're answering Carnap's question, how do we come to talking in these terms, by going down the right-hand pragmatic side, not the left-hand side. Because none of these stories says, oh, you're receptive to the presence of causation, or you're receptive to the presence of probabilities, or you're receptive to the goodness or badness, or the obligatoriness, or the permissibility of things. They're not part of the input. They're the creatures of the change of mental stance, or this posture of the mind, the disposition, which is generated by a flux or manifold that can be described without using that language. You don't use that language, and you don't see every man as responsive to aspects of the world which these describe. You see that language as expressing that change of mental state. You can recall this giving a genealogy. That's Nietzsche being rather excitable. And that's Hume being fairly happy about things. Genealogy comes in two forms. For Nietzsche, most of his genealogies were intended to have a sharp edge, a debunking element. The genealogy of morals is not entirely pro-morals. He thinks of our tendency to moralize as partly an expression of rather bad things like resentment and enslavements of the mind. Hume, on the other hand, gives genealogies of things which are on the whole designed to make us feel proud of having got there, so feel pleased about the language or the ways of thinking that we've invented. So, for example, when Hume gives a genealogy of convention in both the inquiry and in other writings, the inquiry concerning the principle of morals, and to some extent in the treatise, he's trying to show why we think in terms of conventions, including conventions governing things like government, law, money, so on. Why are we involved in reciprocal arrangements with each other? And the entire enterprise is one of saying, wasn't it clever of us? We got somewhere we couldn't get. We got to do things we couldn't do before, like we got to be able to give each other promises, and as a result, we can coordinate our actions and we can rely upon each other. Isn't that a fantastic thing that we managed to do? In the war of all against all, nobody could do that. As Locke saw when he rubbished Hobbes's account of how humanity gets out from a situation of the war of all against all, by getting together and agreeing to giving one chap the monopoly of force, the sovereign. And Locke mocked that. He said that this is to think that men are so stupid that they avoid the damage that may be done to them by polecats and foxes, but think it not danger, nay, think it safety to be in the jaws of lions. In other words, you give all your monopoly of force to a sovereign and look and see what happens. You've got someone like Putin on your hands. So it can't arise like that. It's got to arise in some other way. And Hume tries to give an account of the genealogy, the way it might come about, that in a situation, for example, in which my corn is ripe today, yours is ripe tomorrow, if only you would help me to bring in my corn now, then I'd help you to bring in your corn tomorrow. But how do you trust me? How do you learn that by this piece of by this risky behaviour on your side, because you're risking that you wear yourself out getting my corn in, and then I don't help you back, how does it come about that you're willing to undertake this risk? Well, there's a gradual evolution of a mechanism whereby I signal my willingness to reciprocate, and I in turn risk the wrath of the community if I don't do it. If I break that promise, I'm, as it were, never to be trusted again. And so you gradually get the growth of trust in favourable circumstances. Of course, it can break down. It's always fragile. It's a social construction that can be eroded from within. There can be breakdowns of trust, and as we talked about in connection with truth in the first lecture. But in favourable circumstances, especially with repetition and with the reputation effects being very salient, you can get trustworthy behaviours, trustworthy signals, and you get the evolution of promising, and then the evolution of convention and the evolution of institutions like money, law, government, and so on. So Hume thinks that's all an entirely good thing. It's the progress of society, or if you like, the progress of civilization. His genealogies are bunking. They're designed to make you feel a little bit more proud of where we've got to. See the route we had to travel is a difficult one, but one which we managed. That's a thoroughly good thing. Obviously, if you follow this out, you'll find that the people who go down the representational line, this sort of route, they, of course, think they're very happy with the notion of truth. They worked in terms of things like truth, conditions, and fact. And so they're happy with saying that the propositions we arrive at are capable of truth or falsity. Now, I think in a primitive pragmatism, one that gets you that far, may think that, well, really you can't end up talking about truth or falsity. If say, you've got an expressive theory of ethics, think back to Homer Simpson and that little diagram. Homer Simpson sees pleasures and pains, and people fulfilling desires or failing to fulfill them. And he starts moralizing about it. And moralizing is an expression of being for or against various aspects of human life that he comes across. You might say, well, that's where it stops. why shouldn't he just satisfy himself by expressing the result in terms of, say, boo hooray? So why shouldn't an expressive theory of ethics simply take the form of going yay and nay? And of course sometimes it does. You can, if you don't take, say, ethics, but if you take, say, the vocabulary of people going around art galleries, maybe it's very little more than saying, like that. Don't get much out of that. You say, boo hooray. And not very much more happening than that. It's nice because you like coordinating your responses with those of your friends and your spouses and things. Yeah, we like that. That's all you need to do, is shake and nod your head. So historically, I think that it's been difficult for the people on the pragmatist side to convince themselves that they're allowed to talk about truth and falsity in these areas. Well, part of what I call quasi-realism was the desire to show that it's okay to talk about truth or falsity, even if you accept the pragmatic genealogical story about why we're going in for that language in the first place. You don't have to stop thinking that remarks about what causes what, or what is valuable, or even what is beautiful, are capable of truth and falsity, even if you're going down this the right-hand side. If you say genealogy gets us so far but no further, that's the first stage of pragmatism, then you can you rail against truth and you talk about error theory. And that's as far as, for example, John Mackey got in his work on ethics. He thought that the fundamental metaphysics of the thing was as the expressivist thought, but that meant that every time he moralized and said things like, you really must not stamp on babies for fun, then you were committing a kind of error because you were playing along with a metaphysical fable, metaphysical falsehood, a fairy story that morality consists in noticing things to which we respond on the left-hand side. And I want to say no. Sorry. You can go down the right-hand side, you can rail against the left-hand side of explanation. So the explanation of why we're talking as we do is not that we're receptive to those coordinated aspects of the world. The explanation is, as the pragmatist says, but you can still end up talking about the truth of remarks. It doesn't show you consorting with an error. So how can we think in terms of obligation and justice? There's the left-hand side, I disagree with it. There's the right-hand side, I think it's right. But I also think you can end up talking about the truth of moral remarks. Why? Well, deflationism gives you the answer. Somebody says a stance or attitude-based approach to moral commitment, expressivism, can't talk in terms of truth or falsity of moral remarks. And my response is, why not? Boo to stamping on blind babies for fun. Well, that's in effect said by somebody who says you ought not to stamp on blind babies for fun. But if you can say you ought not to stamp on blind babies for fun, well, you can say it's true that you ought not to stamp on blind babies for fun. I don't know how the baby's got to be blind suddenly. It's, I think it's pretty bad to stamp on dem babies for fun, but maybe it's especially bad to stamp on blind babies for fun. Okay. That still leaves a question. Why did we go further than a boo hooray language? Why adopt the propositional form? And I think here I'd like to reverse a very famous argument that Peter Geach borrowed from Frege. Peter Geach thought that the way in which we put moral sentences into indirect contexts, like the antecedent of conditionals, showed us doing things which the expressivist couldn't explain or couldn't parse. As it were, it was as if you tried to say, if boo to... I mean, supposing my wife and I do go to the art gallery, we say, I don't know, hooray for Damien Hirst. We both like Damien Hirst. I think he's a great Damien Hirst. But we think they both think boo to Tracy Emin. That's very awful. You can't say if boo to Tracy Emin. You can't say if boo to Tracy Emin, then boo to Damien Hirst. So what could, you know, how come that you can say things like, if Damien Hirst's a bad artist, then Tracy Emin is at least as bad, which you may want to say. You may want to say that kind of thing. Well, Geach thought that was an insuperable obstacle, that expressivists wouldn't be able to cope with that. It seems to me, on the contrary, that expressivists can cope with it very well. And I now think the right way to think about it is that it's precisely to facilitate inference and systematization that you, as it were, go beyond a boo-hooray language and start using a language which imitates, at least, the language of very straightforward description of things. So to use Geach's example, it's wrong to tell lies. If it's wrong to tell lies, it's wrong to get your little brother to tell lies for you. That was Geach's example. So it's wrong to get your little brother to tell lies for you. Or if systems of indentured labour are okay, then chattel slavery must be okay. Chattel slavery is not okay, so neither are systems of indentured. In these cases, you're adopting a form which enables you to make certain inferences. And I think that's because you find a need to systematize how you think about things and how you feel about things. And so you want to explore whether there's a difference between indentured labour and chattel slavery. And you do that by deciding on whether you accept various inferences connected with their with the attitudes which, in your view, you are to hold to them. So it seems to me that the right way to think about the Frege-Geach problem is that, is that far from providing an insuperable obstacle to expressivism, it actually shows why something which might otherwise seem mysterious came about, why there's a genealogy of the propositional form, the indicative form with which we express these remarks. And I think the function of that form is, as I say, to facilitate inference and systematization. So you get there a kind of genealogy of where we end up. So you don't have to follow John Mackey into saying that we're playing along with error when we talk in this way at all. We're not playing along with error, we're just doing something which has a utility. Any more than Berkeley thinks that you're playing along with error when you talk about forces, do the calculations of mechanics. You're not playing along with error, you're doing something which has a utility and a genealogy of its own. Okay, well, I've gone over time, I do apologise, but we're cutting into our drinking time at 5 o'clock, but not very much. Thank you.
So it's time for questions. So raise your hands, please. Okay, Ingrid.
To speak also to the audience, our eminent lecturer is a so-called deflationist with respect to truth. I happen to be one of the believers in, let's say, the correspondence notion of truth. So I'll bring forward, I think I can do it briefly, one common objection to the deflationist view of truth. Now, normally we make a distinction. Well, at first, let's say that the deflationists apply their view not only to scientific sentences, metaphysical sentences, but also to everyday commonsensical question. So I think you're right about all these epistemological problems, but let's stick to the semantic problem. Now, I know we use the English concept of flower, and I say there are flowers on the table. Then I will mention the English concept of flower, saying the English concept of flower is synonymous to the Swedish concept of blomma. Yeah. So we have normally taught in semantics a use, mention, distinction. And I think, and I guess all who believes in the correspondence notion of truth, think that the use, mention, distinction is as applicable to, let's take propositions or statements, sentences, propositions, as it is to concept. Mm-hmm. So I can say, well, I use the proposition when I say there are flowers on the table. I speak about, I mention the proposition when I say the proposition there are flowers on the table means the same as the Swedish proposition, det finns blommor på bordet. Now, if we accept that use-mention distinction, then how can we say other things about when we are mentioning propositions? Yeah, we can say a proposition, a factual proposition, can be either true or false. Then you can ask, what does it mean? There is a kind of relation, a rather empty relation, but nonetheless there is a relation. And it's not that we can do away with this. Since you mentioned Trump a number of times now, everything that, since it applies to deflationist notion, theory applies to falsity as well as to truth. Now, what has been discussed since Trump became a famous politician? Yeah, the notion fake news. Mm-hmm. So if, and then the use-mention, everyone is using the use-mention distinction when they are discussing news. Otherwise, they couldn't have said there are fake news, there are true news. So the complaint, not only from me, I'm repeating what many believers in the correspondence notion have said. You can't do away with the use-mention distinction, but obviously you seem to do that, or try to do that.
The bit of your objection I don't understand is why you think that deflationists can't have a use-mention distinction. I mean, your use-mention distinction is a little different from the one I'd be familiar with, in which it's you mention not so much propositions but perhaps words when you use a quotation, some device of quotation. And then I think there's every difference between mentioning a sentence, say the sentence, there are flowers. The sentence, there are flowers on the table, has 5 words in it. There are flowers on the table, 6 words in it. That's a good thing to say about that sentence. I'm mentioning the sentence. It's got 6 English words in it. The Swedish sentence may have a different number of words, may have certainly got different lexical items in it. Words in Swedish, not English. Each of them expresses the proposition that there are flowers on the table, and then I tell you which proposition it is. I'm no longer confined to mentioning the sentence, I'm telling you what it means. That's a distinction which seems to me everyone can make, including certainly deflationists don't think that they can't make that distinction.
Yeah, okay, but as I said, no, yeah, as I said, you can use it. Say at first, I said take the English proposition there are flowers on the table. It means the same as the Swedish proposition. There is, det finns blommor på bordet. Then you in that application, you have no problem with the use-mention distinction. So I should have said, you accept it, but you refuse to apply it to talking about truth and falsehoods, and that me and many others find odd. And we do accept that being true is a rather empty concept. The real content comes from the proposition, which is said to be true. So all epistemology goes on the proposition, not in it is the locution. It is true.
Right. It's an objection, and I'm wondering if this is your objection. It's certainly an objection which Paul Horwich invited. Paul Horwich's book on truth was, I think, the catalyst to most modern deflationists. I mean, Frege was a deflationist, Quine's a deflationist, Ramsey in various ways, Wittgenstein in various ways. So it's not as if it was invented in 1990, but I think until Paul came along and wrote that little book about truth, it wasn't mainstream. So let's go to Paul Horwich's treatment. Now, I think you're right, and perhaps this is, if this is what you're aiming at, I think there's an important point here, I agree. Paul gave a theory entirely in terms of propositions. He started with propositions, he finished with propositions. It's propositions that are true, it's propositions that are come in, I mean, he doesn't deal with a tasky truth theory for a language which mentions sentences. Paul's not interested in sentences, he's interested in judgments and propositions. And people said, oh, well, it's quite easy to be deflationist about truth if you allow yourself to start with propositions. Because then you've got Frege's equation directly in front of you, the proposition that P and the proposition it's true that P are the same proposition. So of course it looks as though truth has vanished, there's nothing to say about it, there's nothing there. And you get the transparency property. But people say that's, quite apart from Quinean problems. Quine, of course, hated propositions. I thought they were bad things to work in terms of, because you couldn't get equivalence classes of meaning. If you start with sentences, then it's very tricky, because then you have a use-mention distinction. So the sentence, there are flowers on the table, is true in English if and only if there are flowers on the table. That's not a trivial identity. It's saying something which could have been false. It's saying something contingent. It's giving an interpretation of an English sentence, which is mentioned, not used. It's mentioned on the left-hand side. It's used in whichever, you've got a sentence in a meta-language which you're using to say what the English sentence means. And people worried whether by simply confining himself to making moves within the domain of propositions, Paul had somehow smuggled out the concept of truth. And I think that's a very legitimate worry. It's a worry about the way he presented the whole issue in that book. Personally, I think he can answer the charge. I think he can, if you like, repair the book, or he can fend off the criticism. So I'm not likely to find your objection conclusive. But I think you're right that there's work to be done there. And you've certainly got to show that the use-mention distinction maintains its status in a deflationist environment. And I think that's quite difficult to do. I mean, a way of putting it, might be to say, look, you can't give an account of sentence meaning without going beyond deflationary truth. Now, if that was true, then Horwich's book collapses. But I'm not sure it's true. Okay.
Thank you. So I'd like you to ask about this... embedding problem for Geach. But suppose you give this kind of answer. So we use propositional form to systematize, to facilitate inferences. Well, then one could answer to that, but if that's the reason, well, then this still doesn't account for our using this normative language, because, well, if the kind of saying that, well, you ought to do it, well, it's really kind of hooray for do it, right?
Yeah.
Or something like this. Well, then if I say, well, instead of saying, if you ought not to, if it's wrong to tell lies, then let's say it's wrong to tell lies to your wife, right? Or something like that. Well, then I shouldn't say it like this. I should say, if you resent telling lies, then it's inconsistent not to resent telling lies to your wife. So when you move, you need propositional form to systematize and to draw inferences, but then you just move to description of attitudes.
Yeah. It's not. I think it's not so easy to do that across the board. In that example, I think you could. You could just get the same effect by moving to descriptions of attitudes. But if you're campaigning for suppose I'm campaigning for an association of attitudes. So, suppose I have the Roman Catholic view of abortion. So I want you to think of abortion as a kind of infanticide, and so I express this by saying, if you've got the attitude of disallowing infanticide, then you ought to have the attitude. I'd have to put an ought in.
Well, then
yes.
hooray for...
Then you'd have to have, that's right, you'd have to go back to hooray.
Hooray, yes.
Or hooray,
No
hooray for having,
yes.
or boo to having
Yeah,
the one attitude
exactly.
without the other.
Well, you
Yes.
can do it, right?
You can do it.
Yes,
No.
But you don't do it. So,
No,
so this is
no.
a problem for
Well, I think it's if it's a problem which could be solved, I think, just by talking about economy. We're so used to the indicative form in other contexts that it's a natural thing
so
to.
that's another way.
Yeah.
But that's,
Yeah,
rather
that's right. I don't think it's. I think you could get all the contents you want by just going up to talking about attitudes, which is very like Frege thought about ordinary inference. You remember Frege thought that in when you've got ordinary indirect context, you move to talking about the proposition which you normally express, and so there's a kind of shift of the topic in a way. So you start off saying there are flowers on the table. That's fine. I'm referring to a truth value, true, according to Frege. I'm expressing a proposition, expressing a thought. If I then say, if there are flowers on the table, it must be summertime, then in Frege I've moved to talking about the thought that I originally just expressed. Now, if that's okay for Frege, then it must be okay for the expressivist to say that if I express an attitude saying, those are beautiful flowers, if I then say, if those are beautiful flowers, there must be some really good flower shops in Lund, which is a perfectly sensible thing to say, well, then I've moved to talking about the attitude. The attitude that those are beautiful flowers can't be held without supposing that they're good flower shops in Lund, or something like that, or shouldn't be held. You're going to have to remain normative. That attitude shouldn't be held without also holding an attitude which is, prepared to admire some flower shops in Lund. Something like that.
I have another question.
Yes. Yeah.
So I had a question on the other side, I think.
Yeah, Paul.
Simon, thanks. I hope this won't sound too naive, but the way I see the sort of general trajectory of your lectures as they're going is that there's something like this, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's this worry about metaphysics which are unsympathetic to in this grand kind of rationalistic style. but it can easily slide right over to kind of a deep skepticism, which can be associated with certain kinds of extreme forms of contemporary skepticism, of which Rorty is representative.
Yes.
And so the difficulty, the big philosophical difficulty that you're trying to sort of work in is how we find something sensible in the middle, which might be said as kind of broadly kind of empiricist-oriented common sense, which is able to save these crucial notions that are really not just theoretically important, but of practical importance about political society, among other things.
Yeah.
So seeing it that way, as you were talking today and following this track, I was thinking in responsibility talk, there's this sort of deep tradition, if this analogy is helpful, all the way back to Aristotle actually tried to elucidate the notion of responsibility, not by directly explaining what responsibility is, but what a theory of excuses and mitigating considerations are.
Oh, yeah.
And Austin, up to contemporary times, tried to do a similar thing. And so the proposal I want to put to you, and as it were sympathetic, I'm wondering what you think about this and how it tracks onto this larger project, is that the mistake of some of the theories of truth that are going on that want to sort of find this sensible middle ground is they want to go straight into a theory of truth about how things are. And that leaves them vulnerable to the comments that you put on when you started the lecture today of Davidson, this is kind of a world well lost, we just can't get access, this kind of almost Kantian problem about we just don't have access to noumena, so there's no point in us worrying about it. So my thought here, and I think this is sympathetic, and I wonder if this would track what you're thinking, is that what we really need is a theory of error. Right. So, as it were, the best way to start off illuminating the theory of truth is by not jumping into what truth is, but saying a lot about what it is to correct things, to amend things, to revise things.
Right.
And that's a set of, as you were just, I think this is actually coming close to what you were saying at the end there about norms, and that the skeptic, in this more radical way, will have a much more difficult task to give that up. Than if just going straight into attack the theory of truth that is problematic.
Oh, that's very helpful, Paul. Thank you very much. I mean, I would like to think of myself as it were marching shoulder to shoulder with Aristotle, and the example of responsibility is a very good one. Obviously, every student of philosophy comes across the problem of free will, and they have to reconcile the deterministic scientific view of what we are with the fact that we hold each other responsible for things, and we think of ourselves as having responsibility and a certain kind of freedom. And you're right, the sides line up, and there doesn't seem to be much room in the middle. And then someone like Aristotle or Strawson, Austin, comes along and says, well, let's look at how it works. Let's look at what happens in a court of law or in everyday life when somebody comes along and claims an excuse. You can't just claim it as a general excuse, I did it. That's not an excuse, that's putting yourself in the dock. But you can find excuses in particular cases of coercion or illness or whatever it might be. And that's, I think that's exactly in line with the Peirce motto that I gave you, that we must not start with pure ideas, the homeless concept that tramped the public highways with no human habitation. You've got to, as it were, rub your nose in what actually happens in discussions of this kind. And I think that's absolutely right, and that's the direction I want to be in. As far as truth goes, yes. I mean, I haven't. The reason yesterday I concentrated on the Mercator example and the Ophelia was I thought that was, as it were, doing Aristotle. If you, on the one hand, you've got correspondence theorists, on the other hand, you've got Rorty and Davidson talking about coherence and giving you this image of us being locked away from the world and disliking vertical relations with the world and all that talk. And then reminding yourself just of what goes on when somebody makes a map is a way, it seems to me, of diffusing that kind of, abstract battleground, saying, just don't go there, don't think in those terms. Start thinking about what we actually do when we make observations, make measurements, register them, give the bits of paper to each other, know how to read them, have practical skills. And those practical skills are demonstrated and are exercised in our relationships with the world. We go out and walk. We go out and look at our maps and drive cars and things. So after all that, saying there are no vertical relationships with the world is just stupid. It just sounds like somebody's lost all touch with reality. So I think that's absolutely right. That's the take-home motto from these lectures. I hope that you've got to be very aware of the speed with which people take sides on these things. Now you may say that I'm being inconsistent because then I'm taking sides on the deflationist side. Maybe I should apply my own medicine to myself more energetically than I've managed to do, and I'm willing to listen. Yeah, I'm vulnerable to that charge, I think. I'd resist it, but I think I know that there's a motive for making it. Yeah, thanks. It's the same. Sorry, another example, of course, is say Mackie. Mackie gives the book on ethics, inventing right and wrong. A lot of people have said it's sort of broken back because in part one you get the error theory. We're wrong to talk about ethics, and there's no such thing as objective requirements that you do things and subjective sources of authority and so on. So there's an error theory, skepticism. And then in part two he talks about whether it's okay to commit suicide and things like that. And you think, what on earth is he doing by his own lights? And I think, in a sense, part two showed Mackie coming back to Aristotle, whereas part one he slightly lost the track, he'd lost the plot, because what he should have said in part one is there's nothing metaphysically strange about these, demands or these authoritative norms. They don't hang out in some platonic heaven. They're demands and norms that we make the demands we make on each other and make on ourselves. And a good thing too. So again, a Humean genealogy would have diffused that kind of air of puzzle and skepticism. I think that's always been my stance in philosophy. I want to try and find the good in both sides and stop them from fighting.
Okay, we have a question on the front row.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to pose my question very clearly, but I'll try. First of all, so do you believe that through observation we are in touch with reality?
Yes.
Okay. What would you say is the difference between being in touch with reality through observation and rather being in touch with the interpretations of our observations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I was thinking that if you're using observation as something that might make problems for someone who has a coherence theory of truth, or someone who just says that we can't really touch reality with our words at all. Then I don't really see how the actual observation lets us have this touch with reality whenever we do observe something and put a description of it, then we are still using our concepts and things like that, so we can't escape it.
Good. Yes, I mean, I think some of the authors I've been mentioning, I think perhaps Rorty, perhaps Davidson, they might well say, oh, we don't mind observation, but in our judgment, observation, because it's always mediated by concepts, that's really really okay. It just means you've got more in your coherence, in your overall coherent, the body of knowledge that you have to make coherent. Observation is just, as it were, a fertile source of new input into that whole corpus, and so, in some sense, it doesn't itself make any problem for the coherence theory of truth. I think that's very possibly the way that Davidson and Rorty were thinking. But I think it's wrong, because it's mistakes. It may be true that intuitions without concepts are blind. There's you could put yourself in line for a causal flux, but unless you can make something of it, you haven't really made an observation. So, for example, I'm not very musical. I know nothing or next to nothing about jazz. So if I hear somebody playing a jazz tune, I mean, there's a succession of air pressures on my ears and nothing else. I mean, that is, I have nothing to say. The expert can say, that's the kind of riff that Charlie Parker used to do, or whatever. I can't say anything like that because I just don't know enough. Equally, I've given you the example of the bird watchers. Somebody goes into a forest and he can just about manage, that's a bird. Somebody else says it's a Siberian chiffchaff. Well, entirely different capacity for recognizing and categorizing the thing. And if somebody doesn't, if a 1-year-old goes into a forest and a bird flies about, he may not even recognize it as a bird. He doesn't know that it has a persistence conditions, that it's a living thing, that it's got ability to sustain itself in flight, or so on. It might just be a speck in the visual environment. So sure, I mean, all that is absolutely true, but it doesn't mean that you're out of touch with the world, or that you have no vertical relationships with the world. That's the bit where I stuck. Because, on the contrary, it's important to say the human way of being in touch with the world is via making observations. And observations do require classification and conceptual activity.
But I still think it's unclear what part of the observation you're thinking keeps us in touch with reality. With the bird watchers and all that, what's there to say they're just not developing their conceptual apparatus by making observations? And me, who's very inexperienced, will have a different conceptual apparatus from someone who doesn't, and then they make a different observation like that in different classifications to different concepts, and they notice different things. But how does that help with still connecting someone to, or not? Well, take away that logical connection. How do you? I still don't think that you have explained how we're still in touch with reality through observation, when a lot of things can be explained through connections between interpretations of our observations.
I don't think a lot of things can be explained just through interpretations. Let's take a simple example. My wife asks me, is there any butter in the refrigerator? Right? Now, I could just stay put and say, do I think there's butter in the refrigerator? I don't know. Or, I remember buying some butter last week, there's probably still some there or something. Or I could go and look. Now, I think it's a great mistake to think of going and looking as somehow very similar to sitting and thinking. It's not. Going and looking is a paradigm case of being in touch with the reality.
But isn't that just being in touch with the ideas of the person who told you that there's butter in the fridge?
No.
And then for you to go look if there is, is just to see if your conceptual apparatus tickles in some sort of similar way as it did for her when she was looking in the fridge.
No, it's a way of going and telling whether there's butter in the fridge. It's the best way of going and of finding out whether there's butter in the fridge. It's the way of being in touch with reality.
Okay, so there's, to me, something very intuitive and appealing about a notion of truth and a correspondence theory of truth, in that when I'm trying to manage how I go about having my beliefs and my activities, I'm constrained by reality, what is and what isn't. But it seems to me when we move more towards a pragmaticist view, then a whole load of options opens up. And so I'm just wondering what restrains me from not just believing anything that works for a certain set of ideals or goals I would have.
I'm not quite sure I've got your worry straight. I mean, I haven't talked much in these lectures, and I'm probably not going to talk much about William James, but James, who had a very, I think, well, I was about to say simple. I mean, he expressed himself very simply. Whether he had a simple theory, I'm not sure. But he made it sound as though for a belief to work, look, he wrote two books. One is Pragmatism, I think 1907. And then he wrote another book, The Meaning of Truth, which was designed to show that the first book was really not as bad as it had been made out to be. And in The Meaning of Truth, he was very careful or relatively careful to say that when he said that the true is what works, he meant works in the largest and most fundamental sense. And it wasn't that in pragmatism, he made it sound as though wishful thinking was as good as truth. If it was pleasant to believe something, and you danced around and it was sort of in tune with your ideology or your wishes, then it worked for you, and that's true for you. So, to take a silly example, a psychologist might tell you that it's very good for you to believe that you're the most popular boy in the class, or girl in the class, because it increases your confidence, you go about the world better, and people start liking you more, and it's altogether a good thing to believe. But of course it's not true. It couldn't be true of everybody that they're the most popular boy in the class, even if it works for everybody to believe that they are. So James was criticised on those grounds that he'd made it sound as though wishful thinking or self-confirming beliefs were true, and they shouldn't be regarded as true. He came back on that, as I say, and tried to show that he had a much richer and more extended conception of what works. So eventually it wouldn't work in the widest sense, in the most important sense, to believe that you're the most popular boy in the class if you're not. Because roughly you can get your comeuppance in time, or given the nature of class life. If you're actually rather unpopular, it's going to hit you. And however pleasant it is to believe that you're the most popular boy in the class, it won't stand you in good stead in the long run, or it would be remarkable if it did. It couldn't be the norm or the usual result of that kind of belief, and so they shouldn't be classified as true. So that was the later James, trying to defend against criticism of the slightly more wild or simple formulations that he gave in the book on pragmatism. Now I've slightly lost what your problem was. The question sounded to me as though you were wondering why we shouldn't go with the simpler James. Was that right?
I think maybe it was a question about the core activity of the pragmaticist, and his answer is, well, and sometime in the future something will go bad if we do these kinds of activities.
Yeah.
And that might be true sometimes and might not be true
Other
always.
times, no.
But there's a much simpler thing we can do. We can have our correspondence theory and say, well, this doesn't match the world, and therefore we're not allowed to go and make this lie. The very notion of a lie seems to be somewhat bland for a pragmaticist.
It's not supposed to be. I mean, it's really bad to say that P when not P. That's what the deflationist is going to say, general truth. It's really bad to say that P when not P. That's the badness of lying. Or it's really bad to say P when you don't believe P, believe that not P. Might require quite a careful formulation, but it'll be just a generalization, which in itself makes no use of the notion of truth. It just generalizes over propositions. It's generally speaking really bad to say that P when you do not believe that P, something like that. And that's the badness of lying.
Okay, Jakob had a question.
Yeah, so I have a clarificatory question about the sort of transparency argument. So if you could go back to that slide, it would be helpful for me formulating the question at least.
Sure.
Because it's
Where's the clicker? Let's think. Let's see if I can do it by numbers. It was about 36. No. Sorry, was it that one that?
no. So where you went through the, it's true. That is true.
Oh, sorry. Yes, there we are. That one.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So for someone who at least sounds to be a bit skeptical about heavy metaphysical notion of facts, it seems like you have a very fine-grained notion of facts. So take that P corresponds to the fact that P and corresponds to the fact that corresponds to the fact that P. I was always of the impression that fact formation is sort of, what's the fancy word for it? Idempotent. So nothing happens when you create a fact out of itself, or nothing happens when you create a whole out of a thing of itself. So for that reason, I have a hard time seeing how CFP just isn't P. Why it's any different?
Right. Well, actually, I mean, I agree with you. I think it is. That is, I think corresponds with facts. It's a perfectly good synonym for true. So, of course, it has the same transparency. The point is that it wouldn't have the same transparency if correspondence with facts was a real relationship to an element of reality. Because then there'd be a question about whether that relationship is maintained to other elements of reality as you go up that regress.
But I thought sort of the solution was saying, well, of course there's like this real relation, but there's no new element being introduced. You're just reiterating, so there's no deep problem.
Well, the reply is Prager's reply would be, if the correspondence theory was a real theory, it had introduced a genuine relationship with a genuine element of reality, then the iteration would not be as innocent as it is. It is innocent, but that's just because correspondence with facts is a simple synonym for true. And it inherits all its properties, including the transparency property.
Thanks.
And that's what Quine put, I think, by saying that facts are, as it were, shadows of propositions which are designed to have something to correspond to.
Okay, time's up, so let's thank Simon Black. Big applause.